25th of July 1942. Kolpachi had ordered Rodin's 28th Tank Corps to crush the German spearhead beneath their tracks. Not all of his corps had arrived, and there was no artillery or infantry support, but Rodin felt that the critical situation demanded immediate action. So Lebedenko's and Lebedev's tank brigades rolled forwards. Fighting erupted between the Soviet tanks and the German panzers, with one 88mm gun taking out 4 Soviet tanks before it was overwhelmed. But Lebedev succeeded in pushing 3rd Motorized Division's spearhead back and captured one of their field camps. Schlomer was alerted, and using the last fuel reserves, he sent in as many anti-tank guns as he could spare to the south. But ammunition was short, so they had to rely upon Stuka's support to help them stall the Soviet attacks. All of these actions forced Lebedev's tanks to go into hull-down positions, and 3rd Motorized Division's spearhead was saved. However, Lebedenko's 55th Tank Brigade had veered off and had struck Camp Group 60 at Lozki. But after some bitter fighting, this ad hoc attack was also repulsed. At the same time, Averin's 196th Rifle Division, supported by 649th Tank Battalion, had advanced north along the Liska River in order to reinforce this attack. However, it wouldn't be ready to do so until the next day. Therefore, the fighting died down. But even so, it was clear that the German advance had stalled in the face of stubborn Soviet resistance. Making matters worse for the Germans, the tip of 14th Panzer Corps was now encircled, which was worrying. Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 had to drop some fuel and ammunition supply canisters for 60th Motorized Division in order to sustain its defences. This put further strain on the limited number of German transport aircraft, who are often used to shuttle wounded or sick men back to the rear, but were now being used to prop up an overextended logistical chain that went all the way back to Berlin. On the steppe, many of the men were stricken by dysentery, typhus, and plagues of flies, and the lack of water was a constant obsession, made worse by the fact that the Red Army had polluted the wells prior to retreat. All of this was no doubt amplified by the fact that the troops in this new pocket were cut off from receiving regular supplies. Since there was a mix of units from different divisions in this pocket, the decision was made to consolidate all the encircled elements into a new formation, Kampfverband Schlomer, led by 3rd Motorized Division's commander. This simplified the command structure at this critical time, improving the defence of the spearhead. And 16th Panzer Division reported that 60 Soviet tanks of Tanashishyn's 13th Tank Corps were roaming about in their rear area. Tanashishyn was clawing his way towards Group Zhuravlev, hoping to free them from their trap. Of course, 8th Army Corps' 100th Jaeger and 113th Infantry Divisions were in support of 16th Panzer Division. But these had to simultaneously 1. Fully surround Group Zhuravlev, 2. Destroy Group Zhuravlev, 3. Contain the Soviet elements that had withdrawn to the north, and 4. Try to defend against the Soviet counterattacks coming from the south. Clearly, they were being pulled in all directions, giving Tanashishyn a chance of breaking through. In fact, Pavicich's 369th Croatian Infantry Regiment of 100th Jaeger Division now entered combat for the first time since the 13th of July. Advancing down both sides of the Kirtlak River, they were attacked by 9 T-34s from 40th Tank Corps. The tanks forced the Croatian 2nd Battalion to fall back. However, the other 2 battalions continued their advance, as did 54th Jaeger Regiment to the north, which advanced against Soviet anti-tank forces. Beyond that, the 227th Jaeger Regiment also continued its move to encircle Group Zhuravlev in a clockwise fashion. But in spite of these efforts and fierce fighting by 16th Panzer Division, Manoilin fell to the 13th Tank Corps by the end of the day. In 64th Army's area, 24th Panzer Division and 51st Army Corps' 297th and 71st Infantry Divisions advanced south of the Cher. The defending 229th Rifle Division had the 121st Tank Brigade in support, although over half of the 34 tanks it had were light tanks, T-60s, so it wasn't a particularly strong unit to be going up against the panzers of the Leaping Horsemen. Worse, only 5 of the 229th Rifle Division's 9 battalions had arrived by the time they came under fire, and the rest joined the battle straight from the march as the fighting was going on, placing them at a disadvantage. Still, they successfully defended against 3 German divisions, whilst elements of 214th Rifle Division held against the 71st Infantry Division as well, with Chuikov later describing the 214th as one of the best divisions in his army. 26th of July 1942. By dawn, Rumyantsev's 39th Tank Brigade had also crossed the Don, meaning Rodin's entire tank corps was now on the western side. Rodin's complete corps now lunged at the German 29th Rifle Regiment in Kampfverband Schlomer's pocket. The Soviet tanks stampeded straight into a flak gun battalion, which pummeled the T-34s and T-70s without mercy. 40 Soviet tanks were lost before 103rd and 60th Panzer Battalions counterattacked and drove the remainder back. Reviewing their failures, Lebedenko suggested that they stop attacking head-on and commit to a flank attack instead. Rodin approved, and gathering as many tanks as they could spare from the other units, Lebedenko's 55th Tank Brigade mustered 36 tanks for a fresh attack. They stalked along the Don River bank, got around the German flank, and rumbled into the rear of the German units, destroying some German artillery. In light of this action, Schlomer decided to adopt a defensive position, ordering his men to fall back to the hills at Lipo-Lugovsky, which they did that evening. Fuel and panzer ammunition stocks were low. Anti-tank guns and 88mm flak guns had been used to take out the enemy tanks, but even anti-tank ammunition was running out now. Worse, one of the division's supply columns had been ripped apart by tanks while en route, and aerial resupply was requested but had not happened yet. It was obvious that Schlomer couldn't last much longer. His pocket needed rescuing, and soon. Meanwhile, to the west, 100th Jaeger Division continued forwards, with the Croatian Legion capturing the area around Selivanov after a period of heavy fighting. 54th Jaeger Regiment stalked clockwise around the Soviet pocket towards where the 227th Jaeger Regiment's positions were. Other divisions also closed in around the pocket. But even so, the noose around Group Zhuravlev remained loose, presenting an opportunity for a breakout. To the south, German artillery and Stukas showered 64th Army's positions as the panzers and infantry continued their assault. By this point, the 783rd Rifle Regiment had lost both its commander and its commissar, which is perhaps why the remnants started to flee. The division's command post was also attacked by German infantry, after which all contact was lost with the regiment. But the 804th Rifle Regiment had just arrived. This was thrown into the action in an attempt to stabilise the crumbling front. German panzers and infantry prevented them from achieving their aim, and they too fell back under the pressure. Zazhin's 229th Rifle Division was clearly on its last legs, undermining 64th Army's defences. Seeing his formations beginning to buckle, Chuikov was worried that 229th Rifle Division's retreat might allow the Germans to overrun the crossings at Kalach. This would be a disaster for 64th and 62nd Armies because this was their main supply route. That was why Chuikov had ordered the 112th Rifle Division and the 66th Naval Rifle Brigade to move to the mouth of the Cher River. It was to shield his main artery. In addition, a handful of KV-1 tanks from the 137th Tank Brigade had just arrived. The rest of the brigade had run out of fuel before they got to the front, but those that had made it were sent in to reinforce Chuikov's new line, despite the fact that they were running on fumes as well. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that Chuikov's line was disintegrating under the weight of Paulus's attack. The question is, would he be able to prevent this collapse from turning into a catastrophe? Without the impressive 5-book, 4-part trilogy on Stalingrad by David Glantz and Jonathan House, this series would have been impossible to make. The sheer volume of detail and combined use of both the German and Soviet sources leaves most other histories on this battle in the dust. It can be hard to get a hold of all 5 books in the trilogy, so I'm going to highly recommend the condensed 1-book version instead. And no, this isn't a sponsored video. I'm suggesting this book because it is awesome, and I'm highlighting this author because we are living in the Glantz era of World War II historiography. If you're interested in the Eastern Front of World War II and you're not reading Glantz, you're doing it wrong. In the previous days, the Soviet 62nd and 64th Armies hadn't done too well. They had stopped the Germans and had mounted counterattacks, but both armies had suffered heavily in these actions, and part of the reason that the German attacks had stalled was due to a lack of fuel and ammunition caused by their horrendous logistical chain, not just because they were wrestling with the Red Army. So, while the Soviets had certainly played a major role in all of this, they couldn't take full credit for stopping the Germans. Had the Germans been supplied with more fuel and ammunition, in all probability they would have done even more damage than they had already done to the two armies defending the Don Bend. But, setting the cost aside, the Germans had been stopped, and this gave the Soviets a bit more time to sort themselves out for round 2. Perhaps their commanders could use this time to get more forces to the front and actually dig in properly, which is something Chuikov seems to have noticed about his defences. The enemy's success could be explained largely by the fact that he launched the offensive when our troops were not yet assembled in regiments and divisions. The truth of the matter was that the Red Army was badly disorganised from the top to the bottom. The expansion of the Red Army had been so rapid and the losses incurred so high that there was a massive lack of officers to lead their units. They simply couldn't train their officers quick enough, and those that they did have were inexperienced. The purges in the 1930s hadn't helped matters, but even without the purges, there still wouldn't have been enough officers for what the Red Army needed in the Great Patriotic War. So, in the July of 1941, what the Stavka decided to do was get rid of the Army Corps level of command and reduce the number of divisions in an army down to around half a dozen, plus several attached brigades and regiments. This removal of one tier of command and the reduction in the size of the units would allow officers in the lower ranks to gain experience in the new divisions, brigades and regiments, and free up officers from the corps level to either lead armies or lead these new formations in a rapidly expanding army. Of course, it also meant that army-level commanders now had to have direct control of many more units than they would normally have had. Rather than having, say, 3 corps to deal with, they had many, many more. If we take a look at the 62nd Army on the 22nd of July 1942, Kolpakchi has 5 rifle divisions, 1 Guards Rifle Division, 1 Tank Brigade, 6 Independent Tank Battalions, 3 Independent Artillery Regiments, 9 Independent Anti-Tank Artillery Regiments, 1 Independent Mortar Regiment, 4 Independent Guards Mortar Katyusha Regiments, 1 Independent Guards Mortar Battalion, and 1 Independent Anti-Aircraft Artillery Regiment. That's a ridiculous 32 independent units directly answerable to him. Deputy commanders were not present in all armies. Until now, as it turned out, there was no deputy commander in the 62nd. The very fact of an appointment to this position spoke a lot. It confirmed that the army was on an extremely important section of the front. I could only say that I would try to justify the trust placed in me. It appears that army commanders were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of decisions that needed to be made by them for their subordinate units, themselves commanded by inexperienced commanders. They're stressed out, they cannot cope, they're disorganised, factor in the Germans, the lack of equipment, poor logistics, poor replacements, and a dreadful communication system which, even if it was working, was intercepted successfully by the Germans. And you have a recipe for disaster. Our combat experience is showing us that control of the troops in the Red Army is at an unacceptable level. Unfortunately, I have to note that the main means of communication within the army remains the copper wire telephone. Commanders are able to control their personnel when the wire is intact, but when it is disrupted, all control is lost. But the Red Army wasn't the only one with problems. Chuikov had visited the front during this time, and thanks to observing the German attack on the 229th Rifle Division, Chuikov realised that the German artillery and infantry cooperation was poor. I was expecting close combined operations between the enemy's artillery and ground forces, a precise organisation of the artillery barrage, a lightning-fast manoeuvre of shell and wheel. But this was not the case. I encountered the far more new method of slow wearing down trench by trench. In fact, Chuikov claims to have noticed several flaws in the German tactics at this point, as well as the Red Armies, which he then learned from by the time the fighting got to the city of Stalingrad itself. For example, he said that if he had had a deeper defensive structure and more anti-tank guns overall, he could have stopped the attack towards the Don. He also noted that German panzers didn't go into action without infantry and air support, and that the Germans had good air and ground cooperation, which also seems to have been of decisive importance in stopping the Soviet counterattacks in 14th Panzer Corps' area. Perhaps, if they could prevent the German aircraft from cooperating so effectively with the ground units, this would give the Soviets a better chance of stopping or even defeating the Germans. Stalin was now determined that the Stalingrad front mount a counterattack with the two tank armies forming in its rear. So, at 2000 hours on the 26th of July 1942, Gordov ordered them and the 21st, 62nd and 64th Armies to mount a counterattack against Paulus's army. Moskalenka's 1st Tank Army would cross the Don at Kalach and capture the Verkhney-Buzinovka area before moving towards Kletskaya. Whilst Kryuchenkin's 4th Tank Army, which will come up a little later, would attack from the north towards Verkhney-Golubaya and link up with 1st Tank Army. Weitersheim's corps would be caught between the two pincers and destroyed. Now, it's worth noting that Rodin's Tank Corps, as well as Tanashishyn's 13th Tank Corps, had actually been the advanced elements of 1st Tank Army, which was heading towards the area. The name Tank Army may sound impressive, but the reality was that both the 1st and the 4th Tank Armies were actually the remains of 28th and 38th Armies, which had just been annihilated weeks before during the course of Fall Blau. They were given some new units, renamed as tank armies, and were to be thrown back into the action, despite being severely undermanned. Moskalenka's 1st Tank Army consisted of just 2 tank corps, 13th and 28th, plus the 158th Tank Brigade and the 131st Rifle Division. It was meant to have had 3 rifle divisions, plus more units besides, but they hadn't arrived. Worse, the 2 tank corps were presently engaged in fighting against Paulus's forces, and had already taken losses, and thus weren't at full strength. Kryuchenkin's 4th Tank Army had the 22nd and 23rd Tank Corps, 18th Rifle Division, and the 133rd Tank Brigade. But only 22nd Tank Corps and the 133rd Tank Brigade would arrive in time to mount the counterattack, meaning these forces wouldn't even go in together. And again, 4th Tank Army was meant to have had 3 rifle divisions, but the others hadn't arrived. The command of the front needed to rescue the 62nd urgently. Neither tank army by that time had completed their formations. They had no time to get any support, had not been coordinated together properly, and were able to bring fewer forces into the battle than anticipated. Tanashishyn's tank corps had been thrown in before it was ready for action. Technically, before the fighting had begun, it had boasted a full complement of tanks in its 3 tank brigades. But beneath these numbers was the concerning fact that the tank crews had only been given 3 to 5 hours worth of driving experience. To use an analogy for this, it would be like a learner car driver being thrust onto a motorway on their 3rd lesson. Not good. Worse, its 20th Motorised Rifle Brigade was only at 27.2% of its authorised strength, with Tanishchin himself describing it as not operational. And there was only a handful of artillery in support of the corps. But on paper, everything looked good for this new attack. With the tanks already committed and the rest that hadn't arrived yet, Gordov would have a whopping 600 tanks to face the Germans. This was almost twice as many tanks as the roughly 330 that 6th Army had at this point. And Stalin wanted Gordov to strike with this overwhelming force against the Germans, who were also running out of ammunition and were practically out of fuel by this point. At first glance, this 600 number sounds overwhelming, but the reality doesn't live up to expectations. In the end, only 450 of the 600 tanks would be mustered on the battlefield, and these would come in piecemeal rather than all in one steel punch. Of these, only 2/3 were the new medium or heavy models, the rest being light tanks, which the Germans would have no problem taking out. Yes, they would have 5 rifle divisions in support, but just like the Germans, they also suffered from huge logistical issues. And to top it all off, they only had 6 hours to prepare, which, while perhaps necessary given the desperate situation the Soviets were in, was simply not enough time for the staffs to get their troops into their positions, nor organise them effectively, etc. So, despite the numbers, in reality this attack was going in hastily. It would be disorganised, it would be going in drips and drabs, and it would be striking the Germans, who were entrenched in defensive positions which were already littered with knocked out Soviet tanks. Oh, and despite having Kryukin's 8th Air Army in support, the Luftwaffe still dominated the skies. Clearly, this wasn't going to be a walk in the park. In the end, only 1st Tank Army started its attack on time at 0300 hours on the 27th of July. As for the 4th Tank Army, it wasn't able to start its attack for another 2 days, with only 17 out of the 180 tanks of Shamshin's 22nd Tank Corps actually managing to cross the Don and reach their starting positions by the end of the 27th. But the Soviet tank attack still went in. Moskalenka ordered his tank army forwards under the watchful eye of the rigid and impatient Gordov and Vasilevsky, one of Stalin's most trusted Stavka generals. 1st Tank Army surged northwards between Manoilin and the Don River north of Kalach. The 100 or so panzers of 14th Panzer Corps in the area were swamped by an armada of 200 Soviet tanks. Luftflotte 4 pounced upon Moskalenka's formations. 1,000 sorties smashed up command and communication centres, causing any coordination in the Soviet forces to collapse. Richthofen's planes gave all they could to support the troops below, losing 19 aircraft either completely or damaged, and claiming 29 Soviet aircraft destroyed. In reality, the Soviets took just 11 air losses this day, but the air-to-ground support was vital. However, even with this support, Huber's 16th Panzer Division was in serious trouble. Of course, the one-armed commander himself didn't admit this to his men. He took naps in the middle of the battle in front of his staff in order to inspire them. Yet, his division was currently split into 3 parts, with various Kampfgruppen attacking, defending and counterattacking in the area southwest of Group Zhuravlev. In this confusing, swirling action, some elements were encircled and had to be resupplied by air. Its surrounded spearhead, Kampfgruppe Witzleben, was hammered by Soviet tanks and infantry from 28th Tank Corps and Pesochin's 131st Rifle Division. Witzleben was forced to retreat from Ostrov to Yaroslanovsky. 13th Tank Corps, also split into 2 separate brigades at this point, fought in the Manoilin and Evseev regions, giving Huber's men some real headaches. In Kampfverband Shlomo's area, the 158th Heavy Tank Brigade went into action, despite the fact that not all of its 40 KV-1 tanks had actually arrived. The Kalach Bridge was weak and couldn't support the weight of these tanks, so they had to be ferried across the water. And the tanks that had arrived now drove straight through Lebedenko's 55th Tank Brigade and steered towards Lipoligovsky. Lebedenko got down from his tank and signalled for them to stop, but the KV-1 tanks ignored him and rolled right into the German anti-tank guns, where 28 KVs met their maker. The KV's hulks increased the size of the tank cemetery south of Lipoligovsky. In 3 days, Schlomo's division had knocked out 131 tanks. The number of kills appeared to be so unbelievable at the Führer's headquarters that Hitler sent an adjutant to personally inform himself about the validity of the reported number. In 100th Jaeger Division's area, the 227th Jaeger Regiment stood its ground as the 54th continued its clockwise encirclement of the Soviet pocket. Supported by elements of 305th Infantry Division and the 177th Sturmgeschütz Assault Gun Battalion, the Croatian and 54th Regiments attempted to close the gap between their positions overnight. But the Croatian Legion took a pounding from heavy Soviet artillery fire in the process, and the commander of the Croatian 3rd Battalion was wounded. Against fierce Soviet resistance and without their commander, the battalion fell back and the entire regiment lost cohesion. The attack was called off and the 2 regiments were prevented from joining up. Luckily for the Axis, Stukas circled over 1st Tank Army, swooping down and smashing the tanks up constantly. As a result of this and the sturdy German infantry, anti-tank and panzer elements, the Soviet tank attack ground to a halt, having failed to make much progress by nightfall. To the south, the Germans forced Sajin's division back across the Cher near the outskirts of Zorovikina. Infantry elements of 24th Panzer Division secured a small bridgehead at Nizhny Cherskaya, but Red Army resistance prevented them from consolidating the position. Because of 229th Rifle Division's withdrawal, 214th Rifle Division's right flank was exposed, and panic gripped the rear service units in the area. "German panzers have broken through and are about to surround us," went the rumour. This wasn't true, but the troops believed they were about to be destroyed by German tanks. So a flood of fleeing medics, artillery and transport personnel flowed towards the ferry crossings over the Don. Chuikov sent his artillery commander, Major General Braut, to the area to rally the men and stop the torrent. That's when Richthofen's Stukas spotted the disorderly mass and pounced upon them, killing Braut and several other officers. Meanwhile, the 214th Rifle Division, the 154th Naval Rifle Brigade, and elements of other units remained on the west side of the Don with an exposed right flank. It was at this moment that 64th Army's Chief of Staff, Colonel Novikov, and 214th Division's Commissar, Commissar Abramov, ordered these units to fall back over the Don, even though there wasn't a safe crossing. When Chuikov heard of this order later that evening, he quickly understood the danger, knowing that the outcome of such a crossing would be a complete disaster. Horrified, he quickly ordered that the already withdrawing units form a defence on the western side of the Don. As a result, they fell back into a self-made bridgehead at the ferry crossing. But overall, despite the chaos and the retreat, Chuikov's men had prevented the southern blade of Paulus's pincer from fully crossing the Cher. This meant that there was a massive gap between Paulus's pincers. It signalled the failure of Paulus's plans to encircle the Soviet forces east of the Don. 28th of July 1942. At 0800 hours, the 192nd Rifle Division's 676th Rifle Regiment, plus 12 T-34 tanks, attacked the Croatian Legion, aiming to break out of the pocket. Hit by tanks, some of the Croatians panicked and fled, but two Stug assault guns, turretless armoured vehicles, from the 177th Sturmgeschütz Battalion countered the incoming Soviet tanks. 9 T-34s were taken out without a single casualty in return. This first attack was therefore repulsed, but a second one hit them in the afternoon. This time, the Stugs were low on ammunition and a bitter hand-to-hand struggle broke out. As a result, the Croatians were compelled to withdraw 2 kilometers to a second defensive line. The 227th Jaeger Regiment was also struck by 11 T-34s and a regiment of infantry. Heavy fire from the Jaegers persuaded the Red Army riflemen to hug the ground, but the T-34s continued forwards and broke through the German line. Pack guns didn't have enough time to deploy. However, the Soviet tanks were now isolated from their infantry support, so the Hunters were able to climb out of their holes with stick charges, run behind the tanks, and knock out 3 of them. The other tanks fell back. However, the Soviets tried again an hour later, and the same thing happened again, except this time 5 T-34s lay burning on the field of battle, although the 2nd Jaeger Battalion had lost a fair number of men in return. Unfortunately for the Germans, these were just secondary attacks designed to distract Paulus from sending units to block the main Soviet breakout attempt to the east, and also the break-in attempt to the south. 54th Jaeger Regiment was advancing westwards from the Verkhney-Buzinovka area when over 25 T-34s plus riflemen with fixed bayonets were spotted charging towards them. The Jaegers quickly dug foxholes, but weren't able to deploy quickly enough. Soviet tank tracks clattered over them, and Soviet bayonets plunged. The shells of the handful of Pak anti-tank guns that the Jaegers had managed to deploy bounced harmlessly off the T-34s, and the 2 batteries of artillery that they had in support didn't have time to set up. 3rd Battalion of the 54th Jaeger Regiment was almost completely wiped out, with 154 men killed and twice that number wounded. Only 80 men survived the onslaught, and other elements of the regiment had also suffered heavily. Not stopping after this victory, the Soviet tanks rolled into Verkhney Buzinovka, where the Croatian 2nd Battalion was hastily responding to the threat. Red infantry and tanks were hit by a heavy barrage from the Croatian guns. As a result of this fire, the Soviet force turned southeast of the village and drove off towards friendly lines. They then ran into Kampfgruppe Krumpen of 16th Panzer Division and were ripped apart by heavy combined arms fire. Still, they had done a lot of damage. In fact, 100th Jaeger Division had never before, and would never again, take as many casualties as this on a single day of fighting, and they hadn't even reached Stalingrad yet. Meanwhile, Tanishchin's 13th Tank Corps had penetrated the German lines and had reached Group Zhuravlev. This allowed 21 supply vehicles to get through with desperately needed fuel and ammunition. But the corridor was quickly closed again, trapping the fighting units of 13th Tank Corps inside the pocket. They were now cut off from their headquarters. However, Tanishchin was a commander who liked to be up close and observe the battlefield from his forward units, and he was with the tanks when the Germans trapped them all inside the pocket. So even though they were cut off from their headquarters, Tanishchin was there to lead his troops. To the east, Rodin's 28th Tank Corps was able to push the 3rd and 60th Motorised Divisions back by 2 to 3 kilometers. However, 8th Grenadier Regiment of 3rd Motorised Division and Kampfgruppe Rheinisch of 16th Panzer Division had managed to break through to Schlomer's pocket. This allowed supply columns to roll in, easing the pressure on the encircled troops. In the air, Kryukin sent everything he could spare to hit the German ground troops at the Don, claiming to have destroyed 30 tanks and 30 other vehicles and 2 anti-aircraft batteries. Given the German tank losses for this period, which we'll come back to later, it's highly doubtful that his air units took out 30 German tanks on a single day. And if they did anywhere near that number, they probably only damaged the majority of them, which the Germans were then able to repair and get back into action. To the south, 214th Rifle Division and the 154th Naval Rifle Brigade dug into their new positions on the west bank of the Don, as the 71st Infantry Division closed in around them. The 229th and 112th Rifle Divisions, plus 66th Naval Rifle and 137th Tank Brigades, and the 118th Fortified Region successfully held their positions on the Cher and Don rivers. 118th Fortified Region was a defensive regiment consisting of a mix of machine gun and artillery units. This had moved to the eastern side of the Don to offer 112th Rifle Division supporting fire. As a result, 112th Rifle Division actually managed to counterattack 24th Panzer Division, forced them to withdraw, and retook the town of Verkhney Cherskaya from the Germans. So somehow Churikov's defences had weathered 24th Panzer and 51st Army Corps' mighty storm. Overall though, this had not been a great day for either side, in what turned out to be a confused mess of a battle. It seems that the German High Command was out of touch with the reality on the ground, as Halder makes clear in his diary. Battle of Stalingrad. Due to lack of fuel and ammunition, 6th Army was unable to attack. After suffering a defeat in his violent attacks, 9 new armoured brigades, the enemy appears to be retreating behind the Don. No, Halder, the Red Army wasn't retreating. In fact, in reaction to these events, the Stavka now ordered Gordov to attack and destroy the German Southern Group, the group that was assaulting 64th Army. To supplement Gordov's battered forces, the Stavka also deployed 9 fresh rifle divisions to Gordov's reserve. And by the evening, 23rd Tank Corps had moved to Kalach. It now prepared to attack. And if this unit could combine its attack with the 22nd Tank Corps, which was also arriving, and time it well with both Gordov's attack and Zhuravlev's breakout attempts, then 14th Panzer Corps could be in some serious trouble. But would the Soviets be able to organise such a decisive attack? We'll have to wait and see. Thanks for watching, bye for now.